Welcome to the Neighborhood Law Center. I'm your host, Melvin Burris. And today our guest is Kitley Covill, Assistant Chief Deputy of the County Attorney of the Department of Law, Westchester County. Welcome.
Thank you.
Counselor. Before we get started, could you give the audience a little background about yourself and about your resume?
I started out my legal career as an assistant district attorney in Nassau County and worked there for several years, and then came to Westchester County and worked at the Westchester County Attorney's Office, which is also known as the Department of Law, for a few years. And then I worked for Legal Services, now known as Legal Services of the Hudson Valley, for a number of years. Then I was in private practice for a number of years. And now I am back working for Westchester County in the County Attorney's Office. And I've been there for 6 years in charge of the Family Court Bureau, which has 33 attorneys that represent primarily Department of Social Services in family court proceedings.
Okay, so they recruited you back, huh?
They did.
Yeah,
they did.
Okay.
I was seasoned.
Okay. We talked about the family court. What types of cases then do the Social Services Department have in family court?
Well, there are three kinds of cases primarily that we do in Westchester County, representing Westchester County. There are other types of cases that are heard, obviously private custody matters and private child support matters. But representing the county, we represent the Department of Social Services in child support actions and abuse and neglect actions, brought against generally parents or legal, or caretakers who have abused or neglected their children. The third thing that we do is we are the presentment agency for juvenile delinquency proceedings, which is any child under the age of 16 who is charged with a crime. Although in family court they are charged as if it were an adult, they would be charged as a crime. But as a juvenile, it's just the actions itself, and so they are called an adjudication, not a conviction.
Okay. And how does a case of abuse or sexual abuse or physical abuse and neglect get into family court? But before we do that, let's talk about that. Then you can tell us the difference between the abuse and the neglect that we're referring to. Okay.
So in all states in the country, I believe, there are something called mandated reporters, and there is a hotline to accept those kind of cases. As we now know from the Penn State, not everybody that you think should be a mandated reporter is a mandated reporter. But anybody can make a call to the state central register and register an allegation of abuse or neglect of a child. Mandated reporters have their own hotline. Everybody else has a different number that they call. And that phone call generates what they call a state central register report, which goes to the local jurisdictions. So in the case of Westchester, for example, if a teacher who's a mandated reporter made a telephone call to the state central registry for a child who had not been in school for a number of days, that would generate a report which is immediately transmitted to Westchester County, since it's a Westchester County teacher reporting about a Westchester County child. And the State Central Registry distributes those reports to whatever jurisdiction the child resides in. That report goes to the Department of Social Services and has to be investigated. And frankly, in all states, they have to have what they call a CPS unit in the Department of Social Services.
And CPS is?
Child Protective Services.
Okay.
And that unit is a specialized unit that is charged with investigating allegations of abuse or neglect of children. And they have, in Westchester, and I think most places now, they're required to look into that allegation within 24 hours. And since you're talking about the welfare of a child, it's obviously very important to get to that sooner rather than later.
Okay.
And in Westchester, they do a great job of getting there very quickly. They have 60 days to investigate that allegation. Now, obviously, if they show up in a household and, the child's in imminent danger or is already in a situation where they have to remove the child, they will do that right away. But, and that investigation continues, but it's clear that this child cannot remain in this home. Otherwise, they investigate, for example, and an easy one is educational neglect. So the child, a mandated reporter, a teacher calls in, the child has not been in school for 20 days, what's going on? The CPS worker goes to the home, and generally an educational neglect is not going to show that the child is in imminent danger, but something is going on in that household.
Right.
And they will investigate that. They will try to support that family. Sometimes you find that a 13-year-old child's been held home to care for a newborn, to help mom with a newborn, and so she's just said she's not going to school for that reason. And Department of Social Services is charged with helping that family make sure that that child goes to school and that the mom gets the help they need.
Okay.
So that kind of case would proceed for the 60 days, and hopefully, if everybody cooperated, it won't get into court at all. And in Westchester, we had over 6,000 SCR cases that were investigated by CPS this year. About 1/3 of those are what they call indicated, and 2/3 are unfounded, meaning whoever called it in, it really wasn't happening the way they thought it was.
Okay. Now, we talked about abuse, neglect, and I guess you kind of brushed on neglect. But could you give us a definition, or is there a definition of the separate of the two?
There is a definition. I'd have to crack open my statute to be exactly right.
Well, we'll just take your word for it.
But neglect is kind of what it sounds like. It means you've neglected your child in various ways. It could be that you've been, inadequate guardianship. It's sort of that sort of cover-all. For example, if you're using too much alcohol and you're not able to care for your child, or neglect is also considered educational neglect, or maybe medical neglect. You didn't take your child, they had a burn, you didn't take the child to the doctor for a couple of days.
Okay.
Abuse obviously is broken down usually into physical abuse or sexual abuse.
Okay. And what do I need to know about, or what do our audience need to know about sexual abuse in this area here?
Well, sex abuse allegations are handled differently, I would say. First of all, in New York State, they have a coordinated response. It's called a multidisciplinary team response. And that means that law enforcement is involved, the district attorney's office is involved, the county attorney's office is often involved, and the Department of Social Services is involved. And the reason for that is they don't want to re-traumatize a child victim of sex abuse. So if, as we've seen in some cases in Westchester, a child discloses that someone was sexually abusing them, that's supposed to be reported to the state central registry. It engenders an immediate investigation by CPS, but CPS, in the cases where those are alleged, will call the police as well. So that it's a coordinated response right from the get-go on knocking on that door. Generally, law enforcement is with CPS to investigate.
Okay. Do you have a kind of a list of mandated reporters? Because I understand, and maybe you can talk about it, there's a new bill out to enlarge the number of people, the kind of people who now would be mandated as reporters.
And the
reason why.
Yeah, that proposed bill is, really arising from our Penn State issues. And it is proposing that all coaches and administrative staff in colleges report child abuse. I think it was probably overlooked because generally you don't think about colleges as having children within their purview, but as we've seen, obviously that's not always the case.
Yeah, but we do have coaches in high school and also elementary school.
That's right. This is directed toward colleges, the new proposed statute. In a high school setting, the teachers, principals, anyone in a high school setting should be a mandated reporter. They just amended it, and they're always amending it. They just included camp directors and for summer camp and overnight camps, which is interesting that wasn't a mandated reporter. All medical professionals, social workers, psychologists, anybody that would come in contact with children and might have an interaction where they would either hear it disclosed or observe it.
Okay. This might sound like a simple question, but what needs to be reported? A lot of people, they see it and they like to report it, but what kind of information do you need or the registry need to really do a good job on this?
Actually, that's a great question because often what is reported is not actually what is going on in the household. And so somebody may call and say, I think I heard a child being hit next door in an apartment, for example. And that will generate a report, and you have to, they're going to ask you the name of the parents or the caretaker, legally responsible person for the child. They're going to ask you, as much information as they can possibly glean. But honestly, often they come in unknown, just heard it. And here's the address, and here's the apartment. And they may get in and find that, there's no child even in that apartment. Or so many of these are, as I said, 2/3 are unfounded. So even though people think what they heard, they may not, or saw what they saw.
So when they're reporting, as you were saying before, the address, the name, the address of the child or the family, the child's age if possible,
Right.
the sex, the nature or the extent of it, as you're saying, is it a beating or something else?
Right.
And has this been going on before?
Yes.
And that will give them a little record that they can now proceed with.
That's right. And the first thing a CPS caseworker is supposed to do is call the person that made the report, one of the first things, and verify that what was actually written on the report they received is in fact what they said, and what else do they know about it.
Okay. Now, we talked about the different type of abuse and everything else. Now, what if we talked about neglect? Is that, well, it's hard to this education neglect, malnutrition. I guess we're talking about if they don't get enough food to eat when they come to school. But what if the kid is being got arrested? I mean,
Okay.
This is another extreme from what we're talking about before.
Right.
But what if he gets arrested? What is the process here, and what can a family or a parent do in this situation?
Well, under 16 youth is arrested. What typically happens, and I can't say it always happens, but what should happen is that they're given a desk appearance ticket, a DAT, to report to probation. And that will have a date on it where they're supposed to go to probation. And most cases, probation in Westchester actively tries to what they call divert a case so that a child doesn't actually end up in family court. Because these are our youth, and family court is rehabilitative, not punitive, but it's still court. And it's costly for parents because you need a lawyer, although one will be appointed for you if you can't afford one. But it is a traumatic experience, I think, to go to court.
You mean if they miss a lot of truancy, I guess it's called, if they miss a lot of school, they can become arrested?
No, I'm sorry if I gave you that
What type
impression.
of
No, I'm talking about arrested for, took the nail polish from the drugstore.
Okay. Shoplifting, things
exactly.
like that. Larceny.
A lot of the ones that we see when they do get to court are like a robbery, where they push the child on child, kind of, 14-year-old, pushes them down, takes his cell phone, and takes off. That's actually a robbery. And probation attempts to talk to the victim and say, what do you want to do, and can we fix this situation? He'll give you back his cell phone, he'll do some community service, and usually it involves the parents of both the person, the child who committed the offense, and the victim. So they're trying to kind of broker a deal before it has to go to court.
Now, I understand that if you, truancy is another issue that's in family court too, that if you have too many unexcused absences, that they can call the probation officer or things like that. Could you expound on that?
Well, there are two parts of truancy.
Okay.
One is when, and there's percolating under the surface, and some states have done this, where they're deciding not to call abuse and neglect, or in this case just a neglect case, for a child over a certain age, say 13, because the view is that at 13 and up to 16, where it's mandatory to go to school, except in Peekskill, where I believe it's 17, they're saying the child is making the decision not to go to school. So mom drops them off in the front and they walk out the back. And in those type of cases, the school district or a parent can bring something called a PINS, which is a person in need of supervision. And almost all states have something like that. They call it CHINS, child in need of supervision, or FINS, family in need of supervision. They all have some mechanism by which they can say that, honestly, it wasn't the parent being neglectful, it was the child being willfully truant. And they're not arresting the child, but it is a way to get a child before a court and have a judge say, you need to go to school. And sometimes that is all it takes, is to get that child to realize this is serious business. But sometimes there are other issues.
Now, you mentioned before that some of these cases are reported, and there was like 2/3 of them was not able to be substantiated.
Right.
Now, what happens to that person who has his name on this list? That all of a sudden there's a report that he's been registered with this registry,
Right.
and now the CPS is coming out to investigate him. And what happens when they find out that they can't substantiate the charges? What happened to his name? What happened to his credit? What happened to his...
Okay, well...
And what can he do if, in fact, to get out of that register? If
he's unfounded, if it's not substantiated, then he's not in the registry anymore.
Okay.
He is... The only thing that exists is for a caseworker to use it as history. So, for example, if you have somebody who's called in a few different reports, you might start to see, like, he's kind of... maybe there's something going on here, and we haven't quite hit on what it is exactly, but, you have a history. I mean, it could be your neighbor who absolutely detests you and calls in all the time just to bother you, and that's a different issue altogether. But sometimes caseworkers will use that history, even if it's unfounded. But no one else is entitled to know that anybody was ever called if it's unsubstantiated, as you put it.
Okay. Unfounded.
Unfounded is really, yeah.
Excuse me. But does he have any rights? I mean...
Well, if it's unfounded,
he...
it's really acquitted. I mean, it's not the same. I shouldn't even liken it to a criminal matter, but it's like an acquittal. You're innocent. That's over. The indicated, when you're indicated, so you are on the state central registry, you do have the ability to ask for a fair hearing, and you should ask for a fair hearing, because, and this is significant in my view, when a caseworker decides to say that you're indicated and you'll stay on the state central registry for a very long time, frankly, it's some credible evidence, which, as attorneys, we know is a very small evidentiary burden. If you ask for a fair hearing, it immediately jumps it to fair preponderance of the evidence, which is a significant jump and a much closer look at what exactly was alleged, what was investigated, what was discovered to be true, and whether they can actually substantiate that when you jump it up to a different scrutiny.
And does a person need an attorney to go through this process?
They absolutely do not. It is a administrative hearing at Department of Social Services in White Plains. That you're supposed to get a letter when you are indicated. You're supposed to actually get a letter whether it's unfounded or indicated. But if it's indicated, in that indicated letter it does say how to ask for a fair hearing. And sometimes people don't get those letters, and then they find out later when they go to apply for a job and they're fingerprinted.
Right, exactly.
And they should still ask for a fair hearing and claim that they didn't get it because people move, and it's a significant issue.
As you say, the way the computers are now is difficult. It's easy to get into those registries, but it's very difficult to get out.
Right.
And without, in most cases, spending a lot of money for an attorney and everything else like that.
Right.
Let's talk about a mandated reporter, because this is very important, because they really have a responsibility by statute. And could you elaborate on that? And what is the penalty for not adhering to their responsibilities?
Okay. Well, a mandated reporter is required to report abuse or neglect of a child, and it is a significant responsibility. And when they make that report, they are immune from prosecution. And so they get a nice, it's a, you have to do this, but we will give this to you to ensure that even if you made a mistake, if it was unfounded, if you misunderstood, if for whatever reasons, as long as it wasn't done for some bad reason, like I detest my neighbor, you will get immunity from any prosecution. And the converse is, if you don't report something and it has come to your attention, and you have a reasonable suspicion, and that's kind of the reasonable suspicion that what you are hearing is in fact true, if you don't report that, then you can be charged with a misdemeanor in New York State.
Okay. Now,
and that has happened.
well, what happens when a teacher reports to the principal or assistant principal, and the assistant or principal does not take any action? And later on, it comes back to find out that, it was an actual reality. This happened to, or sexual abuse or physical abuse to someone. Where does this teacher stand now?
Not too good. I mean, it is on each mandated reporter to make the call. And they can ensure that their principal makes the call by standing there and watching the principal make it. But they can't just follow a school protocol and say, well, I followed the protocol, because just like your certification is to be a teacher or a lawyer or, you have certain obligations along with that certification.
Sure.
And for a teacher, part of that certification is you are a mandated reporter, and you cannot satisfy that obligation by passing it up the chain and hoping.
And that becomes a personal responsibility.
Correct. Exactly
And
correct.
As
Yep.
you're saying, you can't push it off. What else do we as parents need to know about the family court and how they can help protect themselves too? Because, it's one thing as a lawyer, you as a lawyer being part of the system, but what about these folks that are coming in, the parents that the first time they have any interaction with the family court? What kind of advice can you give them?
Well, I mean, for starters, family court, if you find yourself there, is rehabilitative and not punitive in all aspects, not just juvenile delinquency proceedings, but in abuse and neglect as well. I think you find that judges who are family court judges genuinely care about the families that are before them and genuinely want to reunite if they're apart or support if they're still together and struggling. So I think there are so many resources actually that can be accessed through family court. So if you find yourself in family court, for example, there's educational consultants, or you might ask for assistance because your child is not getting the education that they should be getting, and that's part of why they've been truant. Or they have asthma, and they're having difficulty getting to school based on the transportation that's been offered in that school district. There are so many ways to access services if you find yourself in family court. And my advice to parents is to access those.
Okay, now there's one thing that says access.
Right.
Is there a parent coordinator or client coordinator that you go to and say, I need this help, without you having to...
Initially, in theory anyway, Department of Social Services goes to your home, and assuming, as I said before, that they're not in imminent danger or there's a sex abuse charge, they're supposed to offer those services. And if the family is in a frame of mind to hear that offer, then everything should, sort of like the airplane took off, had a little turbulence, and then landed. In other words, and I'll take an example of a mom who had a child and is sort of postpartum depression, so she's not getting her other child up to go to school. Well, DSS can offer and should offer a homemaker to support that mom in the morning when she's having trouble getting herself together so that the child can go to school. And then family court never gets involved at all. It's just that they've offered the services, it's been accepted, and they've kind of cured the issues.
Now, the other question I guess we were talking about before was, and my audience talks about this all the time, is the lack of a male presence in the family court. Do you find that to be an issue there, or do you find that to be so? Or?
Well, that's a little tricky question. I mean, for one thing, it is overwhelmingly a female-oriented practice. There are more women attorneys who are in family court. There are more women judges.
Parents coming in.
And frankly, there are also the moms of the children are often the ones who are held responsible, more so than the dads. And I think that's part of the dynamic of having a child, and sometimes you're just more the caregiver than the dad is. I don't think there's any sort of intention to exclude dads, and in fact, at various times since I've been there, we've had initiatives to try and get fathers more involved in caring for their children, in being part of the system of ensuring that families are supporting their children in however that manifests itself. So I think sometimes there is a perception that dads are not as involved in their children's lives, and I think the Department of Social Services has tried to counter that with some proactive movements.
Okay, well, what type of, can you be more specific as far as truancy list, which is something simple? They call the mom. Do they mandate that the father come in, or they try to find a father, or they put some kind of penalty if he doesn't show up, because that's sometimes how you're going to get him there. And I think it's needed that parents and men in particular take responsibility for some of these kids that's running around that's not adhering to the rules and laws and everything else. And it's very important. We need to. They need to take responsibility, and it should be a way that we can put the responsibility back on them, rather than pushing it off to the court all the time.
Well, that's a complicated scenario, and it's part of the question is what's the makeup of the family. So if it's only a mom and her children and dad lives somewhere else, who was being the neglectful parent to get the child to school? So unfortunately, or however fortunately, it is parent-centered as to who was neglectful. So sometimes maybe dad gets a free pass because he really wasn't in the household and he wasn't responsible for ensuring that the child went to school.
Well, he is responsible. As being a father and a parent, he is responsible. But we're coming to the end of it, and I hopefully the courts start looking at whether he's in a household or not. Let's kind of pull these guys in and hold them responsible for raising their kids, and stop giving them a free pass. It's needed that they should be there and take on that personal responsibility that we mandate for these mandated reporters.
Right.
Let's give it to the fathers too. But we're running out of time. Do you have something that you want to say, a summary that you want our audience to remember about the family court and neglect and the abuse that we're talking about
Well,
today?
I think I've said it a couple of times, and I think family court is not a scary place unless you make it a scary place. And I think it's important to realize that everybody has a role to play, but that it should be something that you embrace as trying to support your family and not tear it apart.
Okay. Well, thank you for coming,
My
Counselor.
pleasure.
It was a pleasure, and
Yes, it
hope we
was.
come
Thank
back
you.
again. I'm your host, Melvin Burris. Our guest has been Covill, and this has been the Neighborhood Law Center. We want to remind you to go to the website www.neighborhoodlawcenter.com for other programs that we have there. Until next week, peace and God bless.